Today we will create this cool animated website together where you have this cover effect, and once you scroll down you also have elements pop into the screen, as you can see right here, and also a contact form which also pops into the screen, and a footer at the bottom of the page. And as you can see, this page is also fully mobile responsive, so everything still works on a mobile device. For example, the elements still pop into the screen and it looks beautiful on every single device. So let's get started. If you want to follow along with the project, feel free to click the GitHub link that I link in the description. Once you click, you find an images folder as well as the tree inside of the GitHub repository, and you can just download it and go ahead. Then you will have those images and this tree.mp4 file. Now we can create an index.html file as well as a style.css file. Instead of our index.html file, we will generate a basic template by using an exclamation mark, and we will link our CSS file by using link:/CSS. Now inside of our body, we are going to start by creating a header for the header element, and we will say inside of this header, we will have a video that will have the source attribute to tree.mp4. We're going to save the page, and as you can see, now we have this video already right here. But you can also see that this video is way too big. So in order to fix that, we are going to go inside of our style sheet, and first of all, we use the universal selector. We said that we want to use a margin of 0, a padding of 0, a box sizing of border box. Next up, we want to target our header, and we will say that our header will have a width of 100% and a max height of 100 viewport height. Or let's just say we are going to use a height of 100 viewport height. Instead of this header, we now need to target our video source, and we will say that this video will take up a width of 100% and a height of 100%. So essentially this video will take up all of the available space from the header. Now we will also use object fit of cover to prevent video stretching. And now we have this effect already. Now let's make the video play by giving it the attribute of autoplay. Now we also want to have muted because we don't want any sound for this video. And now once we reload the page, you already see that we have this video right here. Now let's start to create this navigation bar on the top. By going inside of this header, now we are going to create a div that is, for example, the .navigation minus container, for example. Inside of this container, we will have our logo to the left, and we will have our nav items to the right. And inside of this nav container, we'll have an anchor tag that will have the home text, for example. Now we'll have another text that will say about, for example, and the third one will say contact, like so. And as you can see, this is the effect. But yeah, this definitely looks terrible. So in order to fix that, we are going to target our navigation container. We will say that .navigation container will have a position of absolute to position it relative to the parent element. This is the parent element, so this one needs a position relative to make this work. Now we get this effect, as you can see, and we also want to have for the header, for the navigation container, we also want to use display of flex, align items of center, and justify content of space between. Let's also say we want to have a width of 100%, so this takes up all of the available space. And now we said width 100%, justify content space between means we are getting space, as much space between those items as possible, and align items means they're center aligned essentially. So this looks pretty good as well. So now we will say we want to have padding top bottom of maybe 20 pixels, left right of maybe 30 pixels. So we get this effect. And now let's start to target the individual items. So first of all, we need to target our logo. So we'll say .navigation mind, or let's just say .logo. So we have to create that class by going inside of our index.html. We'll say our p tag will have a class of logo. We will say .logo will have a font size, for example, of 4.5 rem. We will have a font weight of bold, for example, and we will have a color of white. We're going to save this. This won't look too good, and as you can see, it looks terrible. So we need a different font. And in order to do so, we can say Roboto, Google Fonts, for example. We're going to click this link. We want to get the font. We want to get embed code. We will copy those link tags that we have to paste inside of the header to make those fonts available right above our style sheet right here. Now again, we also need this line where we say font family is essentially Roboto. We'll paste that one, and we want to use Roboto for the entire body, for example. So we'll define it right here, and obviously this needs to be a body. So now if we go inside of our website, we have this font family, and probably 4.5 rem is a little bit too much, so we'll probably go with 3 rems. And now we have this effect. Now it would also be cool to have a white anchor tag right here. So we are going to say, let's target our nav anchor tags. We give them a color of white. We say we want to have a font size of 1.1 rem, for example. And let's say we want to have padding, top, bottom, probably 0, but left, right, let's say we want to have 20 pixels to the left and to the right. And I'll show you why we use padding in a second. But first of all, let's also say we want to have text decoration of none. So we are getting rid of the underline. But obviously, if you like the underline, you can also keep that. Next up, let's create a .selected class, for example. And we'll give this class a background of white, a color of black, and a border radius of 30 pixels. And now we use this .selected class for our home element. So for this one, so we say class is selected, because now we get this cool effect right here. And maybe we also need some padding to the top and to the bottom. So for our nav A, we say, okay, top, bottom, let's probably use 10 pixels. And right here, let's use 30 pixels. Like so. We're going to save the document. And now we have this effect right here. Also for our nav bar, so for the entire navigation container, we should use a set index of essentially 10, for example. So this sits in front of the video. And as you can see, now we get this hover effect as well. Now I also want to create the same effect for those items once we hover over those items. So this is pretty easy as well. We're just going to say, instead of our nav element, our anchor text should have a hover effect. And once we hover, we want to change to those effects right here. And as you can see, now we get this effect. But you see there's actually no spacing between those items. So we can fix that next by saying nav A, our nav element will get a display of flex and a gap of maybe, let's say 15 pixels, again align items of center. And now we get this effect, and this looks pretty cool already in my opinion. Next up, let's also say we want to get some social icons right here. In order to do so, we can now create, instead of our header, another div that has the class of .socials, for example. I already have some socials prepared for you inside of this images folder, which are essentially just some SVG files. So you can click on this SVG file, you can go open with, and we are going to open them with the text editor, because embedding them as an SVG instead of an image is a lot better for your performance, because SVG images are usually a lot smaller. So we are going to replace the fill color with FFF, which is white. We're going to copy our Facebook.svg next by clicking open with text editor. Again, we're going to copy that one. Right below the last SVG, we're going to paste this one in. Again, FFF. We're going to save that. And now our Discord, I think we need our YouTube SVG, right? Yeah, let's just open YouTube text editor. Again, we will copy this in and we will paste this right below the last SVG. Again, color is FFF, and now we will also adjust the width and the height of those SVGs to approximately 30 pixels, for example. Now we'll copy this one and paste this one in here for all of the width and the height values of the different SVG icons. Now, as you can see, this still looks pretty weird because they're right here. And obviously we want to have them right here at the left. So again, since we already have a position of relative for our header, it's pretty easy to align our .socials container to that header by saying position is absolute, so relative to our header container essentially. We want to have left of 20 pixels, right of 20 pixels, for example. And if we take a look at this, as you can see, we have this effect because I made a mistake. Obviously, we need to go to the left bottom. Now we get this effect. And now we can also say, okay, let's use display of flex, align items of center, and let's use a gap of maybe 8 pixels between those items so it looks a little bit better. And now we can also say, okay, for the opacity, let's use an opacity of probably 0.4. So they are slightly transparent like that. And essentially, if you wanted to make them clickable, I won't make that in this case because this is just for the purpose of demonstration. But in a real world application, you would essentially go ahead and wrap this run inside of an anchor tag, and then you can say this anchor tag should go to Instagram.com, for example. And obviously you should paste the full URL in here and not type it out like that. But yeah, this is how you would do it in a real world application. But I don't really have anything to link, so I'm going to keep that. And as you can see, right now, this is our landing page. Once you load the page, you get your logo, you get your links, as well as your socials, and a cool playing video. So next up, we need to create an About Us page right below. So we are going to scroll down, and let's say this here is our main content. Now we are going to have a section of maybe #about. Instead of the section, let's say we want to have an H2, and this H2 will say all you need to know, for example. Let's target our H2 elements. We are going to say they will have a font weight of bold, a font size of, let's use 10 rem, which might be a little bit too big, but we'll see. Yeah, it is like way too big, so we will use, for example, 6 rem. And I also want to use a different font family, so I'm going to say Google Fonts Anton, which is a pretty common font if you want to use a bold font. So I'm going to click Get Font, Get Embed Code, and now as you can see we have Roboto, we have Story Script. For whatever reason we don't really need that, so I'm going to delete Story Script, but we need Roboto and Anton, and now I'm going to copy this code, which essentially includes both of those fonts. I'm going to paste that one inside of our header tag right here, so we are going to replace them, and now I'm going to say give me also the font family of Anton sans serif, and I'm going to copy paste that in for our H2 element right here. I'm going to save it, and if we take a look at our website right now, we get this pretty big font, and I think this one looks a lot better already. Maybe I'm even going to use 6.5 rem. I'll also use text align off center, and I give every section that I'm going to use a padding top of var -- padding top minus padding. And obviously I don't have this variable yet, so we have to create this variable because I want to give every single section the exact same padding. And if I want to change the top padding at some point for every single section, I just have to change it at one single point. So that's pretty useful about using a variable. So I'm going to use :root. I'm going to say I want to define the variable -- top padding, and I want to say -- top padding is, for example, 80 pixels. I'm going to save the element, and now our section should have a top padding of 80 pixels, but as you can see, it's probably not enough for me, so I'm already going to change that one to 100 pixels. So that is the power of variables. I just need to change the variable at one single spot, and later on, if I have several sections, all of them will update according to the updates to the padding. So right below this text, I want to have some images. So I'm going to create another images container by scrolling down and saying, okay, right here, we want to have .images - container. In there, I will have an image that will have a source of images/1.jpg, and I'm going to duplicate that image a couple of times. This one is 4, 3, 2, and 1. Now I'm going to grab that images container, and I say .images container will essentially have a width of 50%. Now we'll use a display of flex, a justify content of space between. And now let's take a look. Now we have those images. Obviously we need to style those images, so we are going to say .images container image. We will say our image will have a width of probably, let's say, 10% of the available space and a height of maybe 300 pixels, or let's say, yeah, 300 should be all right. And for the width, we are going to use 20%, that was my bad. And we will also say object fit is equal to cover. We also want to have a margin of auto because we want to center all of those images. So now we get this effect already. And maybe we can even say for this images container, let's probably use 60%, so we get a little bit more space for the images. And this looks pretty nice already. I also think we can adjust the height a little bit, so we can say 400 pixels for the height, and now we have this effect, and this looks pretty nice. Now we want to have a margin to the top for our images, and some of them should have a bigger margin than others. So first of all, we will say .images container image : nth child, and we will say the odd numbers, for example, so 1 and 3 will have a margin minus top of, for example, let's say 100 pixels, while .images container image.nth child, and now let's target the even numbers, will have a margin top of probably only 40 pixels. So now if we take a look at the result, you see that we get this nice spacing between those images. And as you can see, maybe I also want to define some padding bottom, for example, and let's also use just var top padding. Maybe I should have used a different name, but for now this should be alright. And now we also get some padding to the bottom, and now I want to create the context section right below, and I just want to give it some space so we can work on our scrolling effect essentially. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say we will have a hashtag context section, which will have a height of 100 viewport height, so we get some more space to scroll. And right here below that section, I create another section of hashtag context, so we have our context section. And now we should have more space to scroll because this here is our empty context section right now. So now I want to create a cool scroll effect that allows the images and the text to pop in once we scroll. So let's do that, and let's just say we're going to create a class .blurIn, which is empty right now, and we will create add keyframes of blur in, for example, where we create a blur animation. And this blur animation will start from 0%, where we'll have a filter of blur of 40 pixels, for example. And we will also have a transform translate y of minus 100 pixels. And then we will get to 40%. And at 40%, for example, we will say that we want to have a filter of 0 or blur of 0 and a transform of translate y of 0 pixels. So essentially we are starting with a blur and a translate in a y direction, and I think it should be like that. And we are going to remove the blur once we reached 40%. And we are going to remove the translate once we reach 40% of the animation. And now to add this animation to the page, we're going to say, I want to create an animation. The animation name is obviously blur in. The animation should be linear, and we're going to use both. Both essentially means that after the animation is finished and before the start of the animation, it will always keep the initial state and the end state. Which is pretty important because otherwise it would jump to the beginning of the animation after it finished the animation. And obviously we don't want to end with a blur of 40 pixels. And now we are going to use this blur in class for our heading right here. So we'll say class heading. So h2 will have class of blur in, for example. And I forgot to add one more property. I'm going to use animation timeline. And right here we need to say view. So this essentially means we are going to play this animation according to our viewport height. So according to the spot where we are actually right now and where we are scrolling. So as you can see now we are playing the animation according to the scroll height, if you want to say it like that. And once we get to approximately 40% of the page, so once we scrolled up 40% of the page, we have this here visible and the blur effect is essentially gone. And once we go up again, we are getting this blur effect again. And we also get the translate effect. So right here, as you can see, it's moving upwards once we scroll down, and it's moving downwards once we scroll up. So this is this effect where I essentially move something into frame, for example. You can also scale it if you wanted to, but in our case, it's fine. And now I want to use the exact same effect for our images, with the difference that I want to also move the images upwards once they're getting out of frame. And that is actually pretty simple. We're just going to create a class that is .blurIn out, for example, and right here I just duplicate those keyframes because we use the exact same ones, but I'm also going to say 40% up to 60% or up to, yeah, let's say up to 60%. They will stay in frame, and once we reach 100%, I'm just going to copy those effects right here. So once we reach 100% again, we want to have a filter. We want to have a blur of 40 pixels again, and we want to translate y of minus 100 pixels. So this time we are moving them upwards. So now I'm going to use the exact same effects right here. I'm going to say animation is equal to blur in out, and I also need to rename that one. So blur in out of linear and both. We are also going to use an animation timeline animation minus timeline of view again. And now this should work. So now I'm going to use blur in out for our images as a class. So let's say class blur in out. Just copy paste the entire class and give that class to the other images as well right here, like so. And as you can see, now we get this effect. We're scrolling down, they're coming into the frame, and they're getting out of frame again once we scroll down. And now we can also say, okay, we want to have this image here scroll into frame first and this one to scroll into frame last. And that is something that we can essentially do by, for example, saying, obviously, first of all, it might make more sense to have a margin top of 100 pixels for them and 40 pixels for the odd numbers. So our first element is on top, which makes more sense when scrolling down. So now we can create more blur animations. So we could, for example, say, okay, this is blur in out. Now we duplicate them maybe 2 more times or 3 more times. We have blur in out 3, 2, 1, and essentially 0. 0 will start once we get to 30% and will essentially fade out at 60%. Maybe this one will get in at 37% and get out at 67%. Maybe blur in out 2 will get out at 44% and maybe 64%. And right here we can say, okay, get in at 51% and get out at 71%. And now we need to create those different classes. So we'll create blur in out 1, 2, 3, and 3 by duplicating that one. And now we'll also say, okay, this here's 1, this is 2, and this is 3, and this will be 3, 2, and 1, like so. And now we are just going to replace those animations with 0, 1, 2, and 3. And as you can see, whoops, something is not working there. Blur in out 3, blur in out 1, blur in out 2, blur in out 3, like that. And as you can see, now once we scroll down, the first element to come in is that one right here. Then it should be that one, then it should be that one, and then it should be that one. And that one will also be the first element to go out again. So now that we have this effect, let's also keep to style the contact section. First of all, inside of our contact section, I would also like to have this blur in class. So we'll say this here is the h2 that we are going to use, and we'll have the name contact right here. So this should be the only difference. Now we have this effect. And we also get this fade in effect for the contact h2. Now I want to also have a background for our contact section. So I'm going to say, do I already have hashtag contact? I'll take a look. I'm actually going to copy that one down here so we don't need to scroll all the time. And we want to have a background instead of a height of, let's say, for example, blue. And we obviously change that one because that one looks terrible. And we are just going to use some super light blue right here that probably fits to our page. So now we have this effect, and it's probably still way too dark. Probably even going brighter right here. Let's use that. Now, as you can see, we get this effect. Obviously, it still doesn't look too good. So next up, we will create a contact form right below this h2. So we'll say form : post. Instead of this form, we want to have an input of essentially type email, name email, ID will be email, and placeholder will be email, for example. Now we also want to have an input of type text, for example. That could be the subject. The subject is the ID, and the placeholder is also subject. And now we also need a text area so the user can type in some information that he wants to submit once contacting us. So we'll say name is contact, or name is message, ID is message, and placeholder can be message, for example. Now we'll also add a button to submit our form by using button : submit, and we'll say this here will be send, for example. So this will be used to send the message. So now we have this contact form, obviously looking completely terrible. So I will say hashtag contact. First of all, we'll have a display flex and a flex direction of column. We will say we want to have our hashtag contact, and we want to style our form inside. we'll say our form will have a width of 80% and a max width of essentially 600 pixels, a padding of, let's use 70 pixels, and let's use a background of RGBA 255, 255, 255, 0.1. So we get a slightly transparent background like that one. We want to have our items center line, so we'll use for this one align items center, so our forms should be in the center, as you can see. And maybe I'm even going to use 0.2 for this one, and I'm going to say let's have a border 1 pixel solid RGBA, and let's use 255, 255, 255, 0.4, so a slightly brighter white. A border radius of maybe 15 pixels. And now it should look a lot better already, as you can see. For our input field, so we'll say hashtag contact form input, for example. We'll say we want to have a width of 100%, a padding of, let's use 10 pixels top bottom, or let's use 15 pixels, and let's use 10 pixels left right, like 15 pixels top bottom, 10 pixels left right. Let's use a border of probably 1 pixel solid RGBA. Again, let's use 255, 255, and let's use 0.2, for example. So we get a slightly wider border. We can say for the background, we want to use transparent. And let's also say, okay, we want to have, for our contact form, we obviously want to have a display of flex direction of column. So we can use a gap of maybe 15 pixels between our input items. So we get this gap. Now let's also say, okay, we want to have a border minus radius of, let's say, 7 pixels for our individual input items. So we get a slight border for the input fields, as you can see right here, which you can barely see, to be honest. And now let's also create a cool focus effect. So once we click on an input field, let's say colon input colon focus. And right here we will say box shadow will be, box shadow will be on the x-axis, for example, 5 pixels, and on the y-axis, let's use 20 pixels, for example. Let's say the blur should be probably 10 pixels, and we're going to use RGBA 0.3, for example, so form of black. Now once we focus, you can see that we get this effect right here. And for the background, instead of transparent, I'll say RGBA 0 or 255, 255, 255, 0.1. So we get a form of white again. Now, once we click the input field, I also want to get rid of the outline. First of all, outline will be none. And I want to have a transition of, all 0.5 seconds ease. And now we should have a transition when focusing the input field, as you can see, like this. I'm maybe also only going to use 15 right here, and I'm going to use 7 right here, and probably 0.4 right here. And I'll also use a stronger border of probably 0.4 pixels for our input fields, so this looks a little bit better. And as you can see, now we get this effect. And I think it would also be pretty cool if we would have transform of scale of 1.1, for example. So those ones are really looking like they're coming forward. And now you get this cool 3D effect right here. And obviously we need to do the exact same thing with our text area. So we'll say contact text area. And now we'll just copy and paste those effects in here. So taking them, pasting them in here, but we also need to add a height of maybe 300 pixels. And that should be the only difference for our text area. Maybe 300 is a little bit too much, and I think 200 is more than enough. Now we will also say, okay, contact text area should have a focus effect. Should have a focus effect. And now we can just copy and paste those effects in here for our text area as well. So, like, well, actually we can just go there and paste them in here, which is probably a little bit cleaner. And now we remove that one, save the file, and now we get the same effect for our text area and for pretty much everything. And as you can see, now we have this pretty cool 3D effect right here. Our button obviously looks pretty terrible, so we will style our button right now. We'll say hashtag contact form button will have a padding, for example, of, let's use 10 pixels top bottom, 40 pixels left right, border radius 5 pixels, background of maybe black, border of 0, color of white, and let's just save that. And now we get this button right here. Obviously you can just keep that one, to be honest. You can also say cursor can be a pointer. And as you can see, now you get this effect. Obviously you could also say for the contact button if you wanted to. You're also going to create a colon hover effect where you can just say, okay, in this case, let's just copy those effects in here. So you get a cool 3D effect as well for that button. But you also need a transition. So we'll say, or we'll just copy the transition right here. All 0.5 seconds and ease for our button. And now we should have the exact same effect as you can see. And now we get this effect for pretty much the entire contact form. We can also say for the entire form, let's use some margin to the top. So contact form right here will have margin top of, let's use 40 pixels, for example. So we get this effect and this looks a lot better already. Now we can also say our contact form should have the class of blur in, for example. So we'll say class blur in. And now we have the same exact effect for our contact form. And as you can see, this here looks pretty cool right now. And obviously, you don't have to use the exact same blur in effect that I'm using. You can, I just wanted to show you that this is possible and you can use whatever you want. You can use scale effects, you can use rotation effects, you can use pretty much anything you can imagine. The last thing that is essentially missing is our footer. So we'll create our footer together right now by going below the main section and saying, okay, this is our footer. Maybe we will have a paragraph that will have the logo, another paragraph that will have maybe copyright, 2K25, so just some random text that we have, and maybe we'll just copy and paste our social class right here. So copy that one in and paste them in between those items here, and let's say those are the socials minus footer, for example, because I should have a slightly different look. So I'm going to copy that class right here. I'm going to search for .socials, so I can just paste this right below. I think I'm going to keep it pretty similar. I just removed the opacity and obviously the position absolute. So now we need a different background for our footer. So let's just scroll down and let's target our footer. Actually, we already have a lot of CSS code. So let's say footer background will be maybe some form of black, but we will obviously just take a slightly brighter form like this. We're going to save. We will say display flex, justify content. We can say space around, for example, so we get some space around, and align items to center align them. And now we have this effect. Still looks pretty terrible, so we'll say padding top bottom. Let's use 20 pixels, for example. Left right is 20 as well, but that doesn't really matter. And now we have those copyright effects here, so we can just say, okay, color of white for every single child element, and they basically inherit the color, so this one should be alright as well. And again, you could add some anchor text to those buttons so they actually work, but I'm just going to leave that away. And now, as you can see, we already get this pretty cool page right here, where we also need to add probably a scrolling effect. So once we click on this button right here, we want to scroll to the desired section. And since we already have hashtag contact and hashtag about, this is really simple. We just have to go to our anchor text and say, okay, this one scrolls to probably hashtag home. So we need to add hashtag home. Hashtag home could be part of our header, for example. So we can say this one will have an ID of home, for example. So we scroll to our header. Right here, we will say hashtag about. And right here, we will say hashtag contact. Now by using the syntax, you're scrolling to the desired section. So now by clicking on about, we scroll to hashtag about. By clicking contact, we scroll to hashtag contact. Obviously the scrolling behavior looks terrible. So what we can do is we can go to our top element, and inside of our universal selector, or let's say for our entire HTML document, we will set a scroll behavior of smooth. So we get smooth scrolling right here. And now again, clicking on about, we have a smooth scrolling effect. Contact, same goes for contact. And now, as far as I see, the only thing that is left is essentially creating a media query to make this responsive for mobile devices. And to make it responsive, we will say add media screen and max width of probably 600 pixels, so we'll optimize for devices below 600 pixels, so essentially for phones. Right here we have this navigation bar. So what we can do is we can first of all say .logo should have a display of none, because we just want to remove it. It's not that important to have a logo on this website. And now we already have enough space for those elements, I would say. Maybe we also need to say for our navigation container, I think we have for our navigation container, right now we have a display of flex and justify content of space between. Maybe we need to change that as well, just to be safe. So we are going to say navigation container will have a justify content below 700 or 600 pixels of center. So the items are aligned to the center like so. And as you can see, like this is aligned to the center. Actually, for mobile devices, I also don't really need this background right here. So I'm going to say .selected will basically just have a background of transparent and a color of white. So this one looks pretty much similar. And right now it looks like this essentially. Now once we go down, I think this text could be slightly smaller. So we'll also adjust H2 texts by saying, okay, H2 will have a font size of, let's say, 3 rem, or let's just test it out and see how this looks. In my opinion, this looks a little bit better, but maybe 3.5 is a little bit better, and we should have a width of probably only 80%, so this doesn't, take up all of the available space, and a margin of auto to center align this one. Now we have this effect, and I think this here is pretty bad as well, so we have to work on our images next, in my opinion. So let's first of all target our images container, and let's say this one will have a flex wrap of wrap probably, and let's say our dot images container image will have a min width of probably, let's say, 250 pixels. So now as you can see, they are wrapping. And I also want to remove the margin obviously between those images, because that one really looks terrible. Let's actually just copy those classes. Let's paste them in here, and let's say, okay, we will use 20 pixels and we will use 20 pixels instead of 180. And now we get this effect, as you can see. So this looks a lot better already. And next up we have the contact form, and in my opinion the contact form looks pretty much alright. The only thing that we can essentially fix is that we have a lot of padding right here for desktop devices. Maybe in this case we don't really need this. So what we can do is we can say hashtag contact form will have a padding of probably only 20 pixels, which should be more than enough for a mobile device. And we get this error right here, so reload the page. We're going down, and now this, okay, maybe 20 is not enough. So let's probably use 35, but I think we had 70 before, so this should, this is still pretty alright, I would say. Yeah, for the bottom section, this here is not too bad, but I think we can probably also say for our footer, the paragraphs will have a display of none. We're going to save this. And now all that is left are essentially those social media icons. And I think for mobile devices, this is kind of alright, because we don't essentially need this copyright and logo. And as you can see, now this is what it looks like on a mobile device. You also have this cool pop-in effect for a mobile device. Everything is responsive and looks pretty good on a mobile as well, in my opinion.